if Romney were to become president, since prayer and the private sector would take the place of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, as he stated in a Tea Party debate last year.
FEMA's about to run out of money, and there are some people who say do it on a case-by-case basis, and some people who say, you know, maybe we're learning a lesson here that the states should take on more of this role. How do you deal with something like that?
Absolutely. Every time you have an occasion to take something from the federal government and send it back to the states, that's the right direction. And if you can go even further and send it back to the private sector, that's even better.
To which one might ask, even better for who, Mr. Romney? We'll get to our panel for more on the intersection of a hurricane and presidential campaign in a moment, but first we want to get more on the crane collapse here in Midtown. Julian, how does the Romney-Ryan argument of getting rid of government, giving it back to the states, not having a federal emergency management agency, how does that work on a day like today when 60 million Americans may be affected by this storm?
Well, first of all, Martin, as you indicated at the top of the show, our hearts and prayers go out to the people who are affected by this storm. That's first and foremost. Secondly, I think to the extent that politics enters this conversation, this discussion really highlights the difference in philosophies between Republicans and Democrats. When there is a crisis in this country, as there was during Hurricane Katrina in 2005, or the economic crisis in 2008, 2009, Republicans believe that you are on your own. That's what the Republicans did during Katrina under the President Bush administration. That's exactly what they wanted to do when we had an economic crisis in October of 08. That's what they said to the auto industry when the auto industry was on the verge of bankruptcy. Democrats, on the other hand, take a very different point of view, which is rather than you on your own, we have your back. It doesn't mean that the government is the answer to every problem. It doesn't mean the government is the bailout to every problem. It is the belief that the federal government plays an important role as a partner in trying to get the country back on its feet when we hit a crisis. That's exactly what the Democrats did with the economic crisis in 08 and 09, and that's exactly what you will see this administration doing during this crisis. The Republican view is basically to let the states be on their own and to run emergency relief to be the first and only responders. Right. Anybody that has had any experience with disaster relief knows that the states do not have the resources, the scope, or capacity to do everything on their own. They need a federal backstop.
Professor Dyson, to Julian's point, isn't this an apposite moment for people to reflect on what kind of governance we want? You'll remember that the President, in his State of the Union address in January, quoted Abraham Lincoln, who famously said the legitimate object of government is to do for a community or people whatever they need to have done but cannot do for ourselves. Isn't this at the very heart of this presidential race?
Absolutely right, Martin. The purpose of government is to deliver critical resources in a time of crisis to vulnerable populations who otherwise couldn't survive. So when we talk about FEMA, look at the history of FEMA. Let's be honest. Under Ronald Reagan, there was a rather more valued position of FEMA. It declined under George H.W. Bush. It was restored and then upgraded to a cabinet-level position under Bill Clinton, and then reorganized under Homeland Security to an ancillary position within the broader framework there. So the problem is when you have competing forms of disaster for our attention, one which is natural, another one which is so-called man-made, you have a kind of moral triage going on there in the government, and that's problematic. The Democrats have got it right. You put FEMA on its own bottom, you allow it to address federal emergencies, and then you deliver resources to states and to local governments from the central organization of the state, from the government. So yes, you're right. I think Julian Epstein is absolutely right. The Democrats have been inclined to help those who are in need, and this is a challenge to us and a choice for Americans here. What kind of government do you want? One that stands behind you when you are in trouble, or the one that kicks you to the curb and pours salt in your already open wounds and tells you you're on your own? That's the kind of choice we're facing here.
And Michael makes a really good point, Martin, because 2005 with Katrina wasn't the first time that this Republican philosophy of you're on your own during a national catastrophe actually showed its true colors. Remember, where I am sitting right now in Miami in the year 1992, when Herbert Walker Bush was president, we had the famous Hurricane Andrew, in which, again, the federal government took this you're-on-your-own approach to the disaster recovery in southern Florida, and that turned out to just compound the disaster many times. So we've seen this pattern repeat itself with Republicans. The you're-on-your-own philosophy doesn't work. It's also, from a business perspective, person's point of view, incredibly inefficient. The idea that every state would have to have the resources, scale, and scope, all of the relationships with national retailers, all of the capacity to get resources into disaster areas.
But also just the fundamental issue of your budget, Julian. I mean, many of these states are hard-pressed. And when we hear these people talk about this, oh, give it back to the states, where are they going to find the funding for this kind of...
That's exactly the point. And the idea that you would have 50 states having to have all of those backstops is incredibly inefficient from an economic point of view, rather than have one entity, which is the federal government.
Professor Dyson.
Not only right, all that is true, and you've got to deal with your Bobby Jindals of the world who say, look, we're not going to receive these funds and distribute them according to what the federal mandate is. We're going to use the arbitrary calculus of our local situation here to determine how those funds are distributed. So not only do you deal with the comparative poverty of some states in comparison to others, but you deal with governors and those who are in the local scene who don't want to act accordingly to distribute those resources, and there's no bully pulpit from the federal level to do so. You're in a very bad situation.
Indeed, and of course, both of you and myself and our broadcast extend our concerns and our prayerful concerns to all who are being affected. But Julian Epstein, Professor Michael Eric Dyson, thank you, gentlemen.